Page number 222 continued. The essay in the 18th century. The essay in the 18th century. The 18th century is known in the history of English literature for its creation and development of the periodical essay, which was invented by Steele, 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 in the beginning of the century, and which expired near its end. Defoe was a busy journalist, and some of his prose writings came very near the essay form. However, it is Steele who has the pride of place as the originator of the periodical essay. His periodical paper, The Tatler, first appeared in 1709. It was taken out thrice weekly, and every issue contained an essay, mostly on the various flaws of dress and morals. Steele was first assisted and then overshadowed by his friend Addison. The Tatler ran to 271 numbers, most of which came from the pen of Steele himself. After the Tatler, the Spectator started its memorable character of 555 numbers, most of which were written by Addison. As Addison put it, the aim of the Spectator was to attack those vices which were too trivial for the chastisement of the law and too fantastical for the cognizance of the pulpit. Steele and Addison gave particular attention to women, especially their tendency to indulge in French fopperies, follies, and frivolities. Their headdresses, partly patches, hooped petticoats, and other sartorial extravaganza found in Steele and Addison enthusiastic critics who recommended the virtues of chastity, domesticity, and modesty, and also what may seem a little prudish discretion. Addison and Steele became also the moral censors of the age and did some really good work with their satire and sense of comely wedded to a very serious aim. Their papers reconstruct before us England of the age of Queen Anne, with its coffee houses, theatres, stock exchange, merchants, commercial activity, street cries, and the ship and traffic of the Thames. They did well in giving a pretty vast, if not an intimate glimpse of the rural life and manners. The peculiar nature of the periodical essays as practiced by Addison and Steele was accepted with very few modifications by all the subsequent periodical essayists. End of page 222, now page 223. Some differentiation between Steele and Addison may be made. They were quite different in nature, and this difference percolated down to their style. Steele was warm-hearted, lazy, careless, and rambling. Macaulay calls him a scholar among rakes and a rake among scholars. Addison, on the other hand, was very correct, well-mannered, very calculating, and exact. Dr. Johnson's famous tribute to Addison's prose style is worth quoting. Whosoever wishes to attain an English style, familiar but not coarse, elegant but not ostentatious, must give his days and nights to the volumes of Addison. However, many modern critics have turned their approval to Steele at the cost of Addison. Even in the 19th century, Leigh Hunt could write, "I prefer Steele with all his faults to Addison with all his essays. Pope and Swift also wrote some periodical essays. Pope was the greatest poet and Swift the greatest prose writer of the first half of the 18th century. But the most important name after Addison in the list of periodical essayists is that of Dr. Johnson, whose essays appeared twice a week in the Rambler and also every Saturday in a newspaper. The latter group goes under the title of the Idler Essays. In both of them, Dr. Johnson showed himself in the mantle of a very serious moralist without the humor and sense of comedy which characterize Steele and Addison. His style, too, lacked the sprightliness and lucidity of that of his predecessors. Oliver Goldsmith contributed to many periodicals. His own periodical, The Bee, ran to only 8 weekly numbers. The Citizen of the World, Goldsmith's best work, is a collection of essays which originally appeared in the Public Ledger as Chinese letters. Goldsmith's essays are rich in human details, a quivering sentimentalism and candidness of spirit. His prose style is likewise quite attractive. He avoids bitterness, coarseness, pedantry, and stiff wit. His style, in the words of George Sherburne, lacks the coldness of the aristocratic manner, and it escapes the tendency of his generation to follow Johnson into excessive heaviness of diction and balanced formality of sentence structure. It is precisely for this lack of formality and for his graceful and sensitive ease, fluency and vividness that we value his style. The Romantic essayist Leigh Hunt, Hazlitt, De Quincey and Lamb. The early 19th century saw in England the emergence of the Romantic spirit both in verse and prose. The Romantic essayists like Leigh Hunt, Hazlitt, De Quincey and Charles Lamb had many traits in common. For instance, their tendency of self-revelation, their subjective approach, their buttonholing familiarity, their congenial and tolerant humor, their occasional pathos, their inspiration as stylists from the writers of the past, and their visionary and somewhat extravagant nature. Of course, it is wrong to assume that all of them wrote according to a formula. All had their own individual views and predilections, though the conception of the essay was the same in each case. Their essays entirely agree with the tentative definition of the essay we have given at the outset. Lamb has well been called the prince of the English essayists and the essayist par excellence. Hazlitt and Lamb, with Coleridge, are the most eminent of all the Romantic literary critics. As a critic, Hazlitt is sometimes equal to Lamb, but as an essayist, he yields the palm to Lamb. The Romantic age in England was not only an age of glorious poetry, but also of glorious literary criticism. In fact, most of the eminent men of letters of the age were critics as well as creative writers. Wordsworth, Coleridge, Southey, Byron, Hazlitt, Lamb, Leigh Hunt and De Quincey all contributed to critical literature, but the main critics who gave a direction to the current of literary criticism were Coleridge, Lamb, Hazlitt and De Quincey, and it will be with them that we will concern ourselves here. All of them together have often been characterized as Romantic critics. but there are easily discernible in them some very important mutual differences of approach as well as opinion, though they share some important features too. All of them reacted sharply against the neoclassic tradition of Dr. Johnson, the charm of the realm of letters. Further, unlike him, they do not indulge in what is called judicial or legislative criticism, the like of which is embodied in his rather pontifical pronouncements. Their criticism is, with some exceptions, interpretive or appreciative. They get into the mind of the writer whose work they are examining and thus grasp psychologically the nature of his creative activity, which gets ultimately crystallized into his work. None of the romantic critics harp upon the mechanical and time-honored rules and regulations which the neo-Aristotelian critics of yore, from the reign of Elizabeth to the 18th century, had exalted into a fetish. And lastly, most of the romantic critics, particularly Hazlitt, gave critical judgments which are eminently of what may be called the impressionistic kind. End of page 223, now page 224. In other words, while dealing with the works of literature, they depend on their personal impression rather than a persistent reference to an well-evolved or well-set body of rules of critical judgment. It is these common features which justify their classification into a group in spite of some important and many peripheral heterogeneities. Wordsworth and Coleridge. Wordsworth and Coleridge pioneered the Romantic movement in England with their joint work Lyrical Ballads of 1798, which has justly been called the Magna Carta of Romanticism. Wordsworth thought it appropriate to append to the first edition of the work an advertisement embodying his radical views regarding the nature and function of poetry. These views were elaborated and some observations added in the preface to the 1800 edition of the work. Wordsworth said some nice things about poetry and poets, but his observations on poetic diction met with little approval and were contradicted by none other than his best friend Coleridge himself. It was to a large extent under the wave of democratic enthusiasm generated by the then recent French Revolution that Wordsworth recommended as subjects of poetry incidents and characters from the humble and rustic life. He insisted that poetry was in the countenance of all science. He gave the poet a high and important office, and here is his well-known description of poetry. Quote, "Poetry is the spontaneous overflow of powerful feelings. It takes its origin from emotion recollected in tranquility. The emotion is contemplated till by a species of reaction. The tranquility gradually disappears and an emotion kindred to that which was before the subject of contemplation is gradually produced and does itself actually exist in the mind." So much so well. But when Wordsworth goes forward with his theory of poetic diction, he is on a really treacherous round. He writes in the preface, "The principal object then proposed in these poems was to choose incidents and situations from common life and to relate or describe them throughout as far as was possible in a selection of language really used by men. And further, it may be safely affirmed that there neither is nor can be any essential difference between the language of prose and metrical composition. There was a point in Wordsworth's condemnation of the gaudy and inane phraseology of many of his predecessors and even contemporaries. But he broke too many windows in his desire for fresh air. What that Wordsworth's conception about the language of poetry was unsound is best exemplified by his own practice. Some of his best poetry uses a language far removed from the language of ordinary people. Wordsworth's status in the history of English criticism is, then, not exceedingly high. Coleridge, as we have said, took upon himself to expose the hollowness of Wordsworth's notions. That Coleridge was a great critic has been acknowledged by almost everybody who has written about his criticism. In fact, most critics give him the first rank among the hierarchy of English critics. As Symonds observes in the Romantic movement in English poetry, Coleridge had imagination, insight, logic, learning, almost every critical quality united in one, and he was a poet who allowed himself to be a critic. As a critic, Coleridge was a pioneer in many respects. For instance, he gave a new conception of the very function of a critic, which according to him should be to appreciate and interpret and not to judge. He condemned the contemporary reviews because they teach people rather to judge than to consider, to decide than to reflect. According to George Watson, his own method presupposed a delicate and inquiring reverence for all of man's creation and a passionate curiosity to explore its depths. Coleridge's conception of the poetic process needs some elucidation. He believes that for the existence of truth, there must be a knower and a known, a subject and an object, or the self and nature. Out of the interaction and fusion of the two arises a creative work. This work is neither self nor nature, but a different entity itself altogether. Tertium quid, having laws of its own. Tertium, tertium quid, 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 having laws of its own. Poetry thus is a counteraction of forces and has a logic of its own, and severe as that of science, and more difficult because more subtle, more complex, and dependent on more and more fugitive causes. Coleridge's Shakespearean criticism should be studied in the light of his conception of the creative process. End of page number 224, now page 225. The neoclassical critics like Dr. Johnson considered Shakespeare to be a great dramatist on the ground that Shakespeare is, above all writers, the poet of nature, the poet that holds up to his readers a faithful mirror of manners and of life. To mirror nature is, according to Coleridge, none of the functions of a poet. Poetry is neither nature nor self, but the outcome of the counteraction of the two. and therefore an independent entity with laws which it is the function of a true critic to explore and explain. A genius works organically, not mechanically. A poem is not created just by a poet, it grows within him like a plant from a seed. Shakespeare observes, Coleridge goes on creating and evolving B out of A and C out of B, and so on, just as a serpent moves, which makes a fulcrum of its own body and seems forever twisting and untwisting its own strength. Coleridge's distinction between fancy and imagination may also be referred to as an example of his critical profundity. Fancy, says he, has no other counters to play with but fixities and definites, and is only a mode of memory. But the true imagination is exemplastic and given to recreate, idealize, unify. Coleridge's literary criticism seems to be a part of a comprehensive system of aesthetics which he might have contemplated to proffer at some later stage of his life. It is also near enough the metaphysics of the German philosophers like Lessing, Hegel and Kant, who seem to have influenced Coleridge quite considerably. A point of interest to note is that though Coleridge was really great critic and was acknowledged as one of the most of his contemporaries, he did not create a school of criticism. He was revered by a large number of poets and scholars. The young men, says John Watson, who crowded to his house in Highgate in the last years of his life, among whom, according to Carlyle, he enjoyed the reputation of a sage, sought wisdom of a kind too generalized and too occult to them into good critics, indeed into any kind of critic. End of page number 225, end of chapter 5. Sorry, it is end of chapter